High up in the Zagros Mountains, there's a people called the Kurds, and for centuries, they've carved out a home there. Theirs is a long and proud history, and it's really defined by one thing: the constant defense of their cultural identity against the countless empires that have marched through their lands. There's this classic Kurdish proverb that, honestly, it says it all. It just perfectly captures this long, painful history of having to rely on themselves, this constant struggle for survival. It's this feeling that, at the end of the day, the only thing they could ever truly count on were the mountains themselves. And that brings us to the real puzzle here. I mean, if you go back and look at old European maps, you'll find it. You'll see a region clearly labeled Kurdistan. So, what happened? How does a homeland for millions of people just vanish from modern maps? Okay, to figure that out, we've got to rewind the clock. Let's go back to the end of World War I. The Ottoman Empire, the one that had ruled this whole region for centuries, it had just collapsed. And for the Kurds, this looked like the moment, a historic opportunity, a chance to finally get a country of their own. But that dream, man, it was shattered almost as fast as it appeared. See, at first, the winning European powers actually proposed an independent country for the Kurds. But the new leader of Turkey, he was having none of it. He fiercely opposed giving up all that land and, of course, its valuable resources. So he pushed back, and the Europeans, they just folded. They abandoned the whole plan. And instead of drawing borders around the Kurdish homeland, they drew new national borders right through it. Just like that, their home was split apart. So literally overnight, the Kurds went from being this one people in their own land to suddenly being scattered minorities in a bunch of brand new countries. And you can bet the leaders of these new nations saw the Kurds' dream of independence as a huge threat to their own power. And so each of these new states came up with its own brutal way to suppress Kurdish identity. In Turkey, they started something called Turkification, basically outlying the language, trying to erase the entire culture. In Iran, with help from Western powers, they just violently crushed any move for autonomy. Iraq, well, they made a bunch of false promises and then later unleashed genocidal chemical weapon attacks. And in Syria, they just systematically stripped Kurds of their rights and deported them. And just to give you a sense of the scale of this, in Syria alone, by the 1970s, the government had forcibly kicked out 140,000 Kurds from the country. They took their land and just gave it away to Arab settlers. So when you have this level of intense oppression, what happens? Inevitably, you get armed resistance. In Turkey, this led to the creation of the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK. And they turned to violence, bombings, militia fighting, because in their eyes, it was the only way they could fight back. And because of that, Turkey, along with most of its Western allies, officially labels the PKK as a terrorist group. So now you have the Kurds locked in this conflict with the governments that rule them. But this is where the story takes another really tragic turn. Because other powers, regional, global, they started to notice. And they realized they could use the Kurds' fierce fighting spirit for their own geopolitical games. And once this started, it just became this devastating, predictable pattern, over and over again. The Kurdish dream of having their own country was hijacked by outsiders. People who didn't see them as a people who deserved a home, but as a convenient weapon, a tool to be used and then just thrown away. Let me give you one of the first big examples. This happened right after World War II. The Soviet Union starts arming Iranian Kurds, helps them declare their own republic. Sounds good, right? Well, it was very short-lived. The U.S. put pressure on the Soviets to back off, and the second they did, the U.S.-backed government of Iran just swept in and completely crushed the Kurdish movement. Just like that. Okay, now let's fast forward to the 1990s. The first Gulf War just ended, and U.S. President George H.W. Bush starts broadcasting messages straight into Iraq. He's openly calling on the people, and he specifically calls out the Kurds, to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. And you know what? The Kurds listened. They did it. They rose up, and for a minute, it actually looked like they might win. The U.S. started this whole thing. They had troops right there in the region who could have helped, but they did nothing. They just stood by and watched as Saddam's forces regrouped and then just brutally crushed the rebellion. The revenge that came next was just horrific. Saddam Hussein's regime unleashed a genocidal campaign, killing at least 50,000 Kurdish people. And many of them were killed with chemical weapons that, it turns out, had been supplied in part by American companies. And yet, after all of that, when the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003 to get rid of Saddam, who did they call for help? The Kurds. And again, the Kurds allied with them, they fought insurgents, and later they became pretty much the most effective fighting force on the ground against ISIS. So after all that sacrifice, the Iraqi Kurds held a vote, an independence referendum. And the result was just overwhelming. 92% voted yes. But the US? They were worried it would mess with the new Iraqi state they'd just set up, so they refused to support it. The pattern just continued. And guess what? The exact same pattern played out in Syria. When ISIS was carving out its caliphate, the US was desperate for troops on the ground, and they found a really powerful ally in a Syrian Kurdish militia. Just one small problem. This militia was allied with the PKK, a group the US officially calls a terrorist organization. So what was the solution? Pretty simple, really. The US just asked them to change their name, to rebrand as the Syrian Democratic Forces. And once they did that, the US started training them, funding them, and arming them. And it worked. This Kurdish-led force was key in defeating ISIS. But then, in 2019, the promise was broken. Again, the US just suddenly pulled its troops out, leaving their allies completely exposed. This basically gave Turkey, a NATO ally, a green light to invade and to attack the very same Kurdish forces that the US had just finished arming and training. So, all of this brings us to today. And right now, the future for the Kurds across this entire region is maybe more uncertain than it has ever been. All those decades of struggle, of being betrayed, it's left them in this incredibly dangerous and unstable position. If you look at Iraq, their hard-won autonomy is slipping away as the central government fights to get control of their oil. In Turkey, the military and political crackdowns just keep on coming. Over in Iran, Kurdish groups are still fighting for a state of their own. And in Syria, well, they're holding on to a small piece of autonomous land, but they're surrounded by enemies and they've learned the hard way they can't count on American protection. And when you step back and look at all of this, you see the real tragedy, the central irony of the Kurdish story. Their greatest strength, this incredible, unwavering will to fight for who they are, it actually became their biggest liability. For the nations they found themselves in, that strength was a threat. And for the world's great powers, it was just a useful tool. A tool to be used in their big geopolitical games and then just tossed aside when they were done. So this leaves us with one final, really big question. After an entire century of being used, of being betrayed, of literally being erased from the map, what is the future for a people who have fought so incredibly hard, but still don't have a nation to call their own?